Okay. Is my camera on? I've meant to do that also. I don't know how
Oh,
to
it
do it.
is.
There it is now? Okay.
Yeah.
I can't see my camera, so you're just going to have to enjoy my face while I talk. Okay. Welcome, guys, to the first installment of the Gender Discussion, Gender and Economics paper discussion group. This started because I was working on a research project with respect to gender in Tanzania, and I was covering a lot of the literature, and it felt like, here's a synergy, you know, let's talk about some of this literature I've read. Let's talk about some of this literature that I've read and share that with other people and talk a bit about it, these issues. I think also, you know, I have a certain comfort level talking about women's issues. I grew up around a lot of women and women in strong positions in organizations. And my mom was an executive at a nonprofit organization. So I feel very comfortable talking about women's issues. I have a lot of female friends. And anyway, so that's the genesis of how this got started. We have some very interesting subject matter. I have a long form version of the discussion papers that I'm going to use basically for the basis of a 16-week course in gender economics. And I'm hoping to be a teacher and a professor of economics. So I think this makes sense. All right. So let's talk about this week's subject is domestic violence. It's not that easy of a subject, I think, for a lot of people to talk about. It's a highly stigmatized subject. And I think that there's a lot of jokes about domestic violence. And I think that's not helpful in addressing the seriousness of domestic violence and the effects that it has on women and men in our society. Let's talk a little bit first about what domestic violence is. So this is coming from a report, I believe it's a CDC report that I pulled up. There's a pretty good data on domestic violence. We don't have like panel data or anything, but there's pretty good surveys that are being collected. So we have a pretty good idea, you know, what the incidence rate of domestic violence is. Domestic violence, it talks about it as well in the introduction to the paper, the impact of household, the paper that we read for this week, or I assume some of you read, or I'm going to talk about the impact of household shocks on domestic violence, evidence from Tanzania. And it explains how domestic violence is a serious problem that plagues a lot of people in developing countries. And even in the United States itself, many women die at the hands of their intimate partners. So this is important, and I'm going to talk mostly not about the women that are murdered, but I think that's important to keep in mind that it's very easy to imagine that's a huge economic cost, which is the loss of human capital associated with those women who die. Here's what we're talking about when we're talking about domestic violence. All of these things fall under the category: sexual violence, which I think we all have a pretty good understanding of implicitly. Stalking, which is not just like driving past your partner's house once after you broke up crying. That's not stalking. And following them on the internet, you know, that's not for me stalking. Some people are joining, following someone and sort of, I think that when it reaches it seems like when it reaches the level of stalking, it's like coming close to also being psychological aggression, where you're trying to control, you're trying to emotionally terrorize the other person. So that's how I would describe that. And also, you know, there's regular old physical violence, which includes, in this definition, shoving and slapping. And I think some people would say, you know, oh, slapping doesn't count. It's a minor thing. Husband is entitled to slap his wife. Wives probably slap their husbands. Probably does happen. Psychological aggression, which is probably the most interesting from that report. I have the citation here at the end, and I'll post the slides after for the references and for the details. And that's really a sort of pattern of bullying by an intimate partner. And that counts as domestic violence. And I want to talk about, I think it's in the next slide. let me check. Okay, so, oh yeah, here. So I think it's first, like next I want to talk a little about domestic violence versus intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence is when your sexual partner or your long-term partner, the person that you're dating, your boyfriend or girlfriend, commits an act of commits one of those acts that we listed on the previous slide against you. And then domestic violence more broadly could mean any kind of act that occurs within a familial environment, such as a parent on a child on a parent, a child on another child. If one child is psychologically aggressing another child, I guess we're saying that this falls under the category of domestic violence now. And what does it mean? And I think that's important to mention because I think that sort of shows that the definition may be evolving as our understanding about the psychological effects of bullying and psychological harassment evolve as well. And why does gender matter? Why does domestic violence matter with respect to gender? Okay, this is I said already before, that a lot of women die at the hands of their intimate partner. But also, and I want to mention that men do suffer incidents of domestic violence. You have incidents of domestic violence in the gay community. You have lesbian domestic violence. You have homosexual domestic violence, and they all exist, and they're all a serious matter. But in general, women are the ones who are bearing the brunt of the burden, especially in other countries, as it talks about in the paper. Domestic violence is prevalent, not in one country, and it's not, there's no country that's domestic violence free, but developing countries, and as we'll see, as confirmed by the results in the paper, sort of lower income places seem to be strongly correlated with more and higher rates of domestic violence. Okay, so I'm curious, and I want you guys to, well, let's see, hold on one second. I got ahead of myself. All right, so this paper, let's talk a little bit about an overview of this paper. So I just want to mention that Dr. Olukorede Abiona is a professor at University of Technology, Sydney, and Martin Foro Koppensteiner is at, I think he switched from University of Leicester and he's not there now, but he's an IZA fellow. They're both professors of economics. And Abiona is a bit interesting, and it's relevant to this paper, which is that he seems to specialize in utilizing exogenous rainfall shocks for a bunch of stuff. So he has 5 or 6 papers that utilize exogenous rainfall shocks to test for the effects of income shocks on other things. And that is a valid empirical strategy, and we're going to look into that more as we get through the paper. This is an applied micro paper, and I think both of them are applied micro specialists. Okay. So this paper is sort of at the edge of economics and sociology, but I think it's very important to understand that this is an economic question and there are serious economic effects of these incidents. This paper is using 2008-2009 longitudinal survey funded by the World Bank and made in partnership with the World Bank and the Tanzanian Statistical Authority. And in 2008-2009 version of the survey, they collected very detailed information about domestic violence and acts of domestic violence. They had special interviewers who were specially trained, and those interviewers pulled the women aside, had the women separately, and talked to the women separately, and so that they could elicit more truthful responses. And in the paper, the unit of observation is both, it seems, at the household and individual level. So the responses are at the individual level, but it seems like that's a pretty safe bet that most of the dynamic is going on at the household level. And this comes to an important question that I would like you guys to keep in mind throughout the entirety of this discussion group, which is the question of, the old version, in air quotes, of the household model with the household head as a dictator, and the newer version of the household model, which is including each individual. It's kind of the micro-founded version of the household model, if you will, which is including all of the members of the household and recognizing that each of the members of the household may not have perfectly overlapping utility. So the wife might derive utility from one thing and the husband might derive utility from another thing. And when we mask this heterogeneity if we use a household model that assumes that the head is a dictator. But that might be a better assumption in a place where gender norms, are more focused on the male than the female, and where the household head, this model of household head as dictator might make sense more in some places than in other places. And I think this is an important theme to keep in mind. And we're going to talk more explicitly. I would like to talk more explicitly about it at some point. Okay, and the identification strategy, okay, just referring to the empirics, this paper has no explicit economic theory. The identification strategy here is using changes in rainfall, deviations from long run average rainfall, to measure the effects of income shocks on incidents of domestic violence. Okay, now I'm curious, like, I want you guys to think in your mind, you know, what's the prior here? What do you think the effect of a negative income shock would be on domestic violence? Would it be an increase or a decrease on domestic violence? I think it's fairly obvious. I think we can all agree that it would be that increases or decreases in rain. This is incorrect on the second part of the sentence. Decreases in income should increase the domestic violence. No, sorry, the second part is correct. And then there's a question of if it, so I have some issues, and I'll get to that in a second with the paper, but even increases in rain could potentially, if there's flooding, could potentially ruin a harvest. So I think it's possible that increases in rain could also increase domestic violence. That's not what they find, but I still think it's possible at a certain point. And Tanzania is a developing country. It's a poorer country on the poorer end, maybe slightly wealthier than some of the countries in the region, but not wealthy, you know, by Western standard or by, you know, North American standard. Okay. And Tanzania, you know, from what I hear anecdotally and from my research that I've done, seems quite backward with respect to gender roles. And that's one of the areas where that seems really important. We don't talk about it today, but it will come to that at the very end of the reading group, is widowhood, an asset inheritance by widows. And widows are treated very poorly in the community, widows and divorcees. So I talked about this a little bit, the overlapping utility functions in the household model, opening up the household model from the dictator model and starting to look more at that. A lot of recent economic papers are doing just that. We even have a theoretical construct for that. It's called the separate spheres bargaining model. And in that separate spheres bargaining model, you have a sort of negotiation between a husband and a wife that's sort of in equilibrium, and they each have a threat point which is correlated with their assets. And there's research in economics that finds out what happens when you adjust the balance of the assets towards one or the other, and what are the effects on household well-being and other things such as that. So there is work, a lot of work examining these questions, but it's still a fertile area, I would say, for plenty of research. There's plenty of areas to explore, in other words. I like the empirical strategy. I would say my overall, you know, comments on the paper are that it's a good paper. I think I have more on that in the next slide, but the paper uses rainfall shocks. It's certainly plausibly exogenous, no question about it. It's not really novel, but who cares? I don't think that's maybe that's a strike against it. We can talk about why this paper isn't published yet also at the end. But I think that with respect to a thesis chapter, this would be an excellent thesis chapter. And might even be a good enough job market paper if you were thinking about it that way. It probably would be a good enough job market paper. So in other words, when you're an econ PhD student, you generally write 3 papers, and usually one of them is the stronger one, and that's the one that you shop around when you're ready to apply for jobs. Okay. I think the strengths of the paper are that there are really good robustness checks. They go through a bunch of them, and we probably won't talk about all of them today, but especially the one where they control for different levels of income and then check the results again. They have a large sample, so it makes it a little easier to do that. The weaknesses of the paper are that we don't have panel data. The best would be to have measurements of the same individuals over time. Almost always would be better. It gives us a lot more flexibility in how we estimate treatment effects. So it's cross-sectional, and unfortunately, they didn't find statistically significant at standard levels effect of income shocks on domestic violence incidents, but they found it at, you know, non-standard confidence levels. Okay. And then I'm going to add just like a couple more thoughts, and then I'll just open it up in case anybody has any questions or they want to say about the or stuff they want to add or talk about or whatever. So I think the question, I have kind of a little question. So there's not that much to talk about because it's just a pretty clean empirical paper. As I said, I believe, and we can open to discussion, you know, that rainfall is very plausibly exogenous. Maybe some people will disagree with that. And they find, you know, I think a 10% increase in the overall category of domestic violence incidents with a rainfall, with a 1 standard deviation deviation from change in rainfall. And then they basically just check this parameter estimate in several different contexts. They also find that, interestingly, you know, that on the lower income, there's more incidents of domestic violence, or it's more prevalent. The stronger the relationship is much stronger for households at lower levels of income. I think that's intuitive, but still interesting to hear and interesting finding. Yeah, I don't like some of their, so I think that the map that shows where Tanzania is in Africa is a joke. If you're reading a paper about Africa, you should know where Tanzania is. And if the paper is about Tanzania, I think most people probably know where Tanzania is. It sort of says to me that the authors didn't know where Tanzania is, and that's why they put the map there. I'm a big maps guy. Then why is this paper not published? It seems like I found the first version coming out in 2016, so it's been 2 years. They have a bunch of robustness checks. Maybe it's been getting kicked around from journal to journal, or maybe they're just not even bothering anymore because this is already in the public eye and this is a no result. So maybe they're biased against this finding. And also, this is kind of derivative, like the innovative strategy of using rainfall shocks to instrument for income shocks. You know, it seems to have been kind of, it has been beaten to death. I will say that, but that does not mean that it is no longer a feasible or valid empirical strategy. I think that's really important. Okay, I think that's all that I have. And I'm going to, anybody who wants to have questions or discuss the paper, any specifics, would like to open up. Oh yeah, here's the map of Tanzania on page 42. Just unbelievable. And then I looked at the heat maps and I was kind of hoping that one of them would be a heat map of domestic violence, but they're not. They're heat maps of rainfall shocks. Ward, I thought you had prepared at least one question. I muted you also. Please unmute yourself also, yeah.
Well, I mean, wouldn't you think that the map of domestic violence would somewhat overlap the heat map of the rainfall shocks, right? At least in the areas where they were negative rainfall shocks, right, or the dry shocks.
You know, maybe the reason that they didn't do that is they didn't want to open themselves up to criticism about avoiding using spatial clustering and testing for spatial clusters, because it seems likely that there could be it seems likely there could be social effects that are social or both path dependence and network effects of domestic violence. So a peer effects, like in your family, your brother hits his wife and so you hit your wife too, or something along those lines. I don't mean to be glib about it. Or, you know, in your family, your dad had a tradition of hitting his wife, so now you hit your wife too, something like that. So in that case, there could be kind of clustering at the village level, or if villages are clustered.
Well, they did. I mean, I think they did cluster at the enumeration level.
Yeah, those were good. That was good. They did, but I didn't buy the cluster. This is the same data set, by the way, guys, that I'm using for my thesis. So this is a data set I know intimately. I think that the clustering at the village level was the best. I don't think clustering at the region. Yeah, I didn't buy it. I would never do it in my paper.
Okay. So is an enumeration area akin to village level?
Yes. And they map all the villages, so you can see there's quite, I don't know why they have some missing also from their map. It's a little, I have a map of all the villages and there are none missing. And also, you know, an important point about Tanzania, I think it's an important point on understanding the context of the country that we're looking at here. It's a very large, geographically large country. And, you know, at the bottom, there's households and villages that are being measured that are right close to Mozambique, could have different culture, and Malawi. There could be, you know, very different traditions than you have in the north, which is right next to Kenya and Rwanda and Burundi. So there's that. And there could be spillovers from those countries into Tanzania. So you have some potential for maybe measuring effects across borders if you had matching data that you could match from one of those neighboring countries. And Malawi, there is matching countrywide longitudinal data that you can match to the Tanzania data. That could be interesting. But I wanted to mention that Pemba and Zanzibar, those are the two islands that you see on the maps that are right off the coast of Tanzania, but that are Tanzanian islands. There's a bunch of households on those islands, villages that got measured. So it's important to control for that as well. I guess the village level fixed effects would control for that, but it's important to keep that in mind. Those villages could be potentially very different from other villages.
Do you have any thoughts on any of the robustness checks at all, or?
Yes, I thought that the one by, I mean, the more you can split the sample down, the better. Oh yeah. So splitting the sample by the gender was interesting. There's almost no, it seems like there's no relationship between incidence in women-headed households, but that makes sense to me. Women households don't see a lot of propagation of domestic violence. Still possible, but we just don't see a statistically significant relationship there. But it makes sense because the power imbalance is on the male side. So in almost all cases. So that's consistent for me. And in a women-headed household, I mean, I guess they could hit their kids. I don't know. It seems like they're doing it less, according to this data.
And then one more question. If from table 4, I'm not sure if I understood this from the paper, the exactly what their variable domestic violence incidence versus domestic violence index, sort of what the difference is there, how they constructed those, and then, I mean, the actual interpretation of these coefficients is like, are they probabilities?
I think, are you talking about the one that's disaggregated? Like it has like column 1 slapped, column 2 pushed, column 3 hit?
Table 4, where they split it into panel A, panel B.
Okay, wait a sec.
Yep.
Oh yeah, this is with the intensity as a variable. Number of incidents.
And that's what the index is the number of incidents
weighted by the number of incidents. Yeah.
Okay, over the sample period.
Yeah, but I don't. Yeah.
But then is domestic violence incidence just like a 0-1 variable, and so what we're measuring here is a probability of domestic violence occurring?
Yeah, I think for me it's more a 1-0. I mean, I don't.
Okay.
The intensity, I think you would want to theoretically justify why you think intensity should be correlated with the size. I would want to have larger income shocks also, possibly. And
okay.
I don't see why intensity should vary that much with income. I see why in my own mind.
And so is that what the index is capturing, is intensity of?
Yeah, it's like
okay.
Intensity of treatment.
Okay.
Sorry, it's not intensity of treatment because that's the dependent variable. Intensity of treatment would be the intensity of rainfall shocks. So if you had 1 or 2 standard deviation change in rainfall shocks in the independent variable side.
Right.
Any other questions? All right, guys. Well, I'm really excited about this discussion group. And I'm looking forward to next week. I'm glad there were so many of you here today. And even if you don't read the papers, I don't mind. Just come listen to me talk about whatever the subject matter is and listen to a few of us banter about it. And I think that's good too. So I'm going to stop here.
I guess I got a question. What would you have done differently if you were in charge for this paper? Because you touched on a couple things, because you said this does relate to your research or your work. So I'm just curious because I'm not an economist. But I hope to one day be, and I want to kind of get an idea, some of what would you do to have, I don't know, massage. I don't know exactly the terminology that you guys use, but it was clear that you were you see that this is very promising data, but what's the real issue that? I'll just let you talk. How about that?
No, I understand. Okay, so I wasn't meaning to throw heavy shade at this paper. I think it's a very solid paper. I think they did the best they could conditional on the data that they had. And since we work a lot with observational data, that's often the constraint that you're facing. If I would have started, here's another, I'll give you a reverse ask. This is the important thing maybe to think about sometimes is if you wanted to have the best quality data to measure this, what would you measure? And if I could answer that question, I would say, I would like to have panel data with the same women over time and going through changes in life, income shocks, so that you can control for individual level, unobservable heterogeneity using panel data. That's powerful. So if I wanted to say, so I probably wouldn't change that much if it were my paper and my data set. If I was collecting the data from scratch, I would probably collect panel data. That's what I would do.
Yep. So I guess a follow-up question, do you think the results of this paper kind of stem from the data itself rather than the actual like research that went into it, the methodology and the approach that they took?
I find it convincing. Even at the 10% level, I don't care. I think it's really indicative, but it's not significant at standard levels in air quotes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I worship at the cult of 0.05.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I'm a 0.01er myself. Anything else? All right, guys, I really appreciate it. Let's end it here. And that was already a while, longer than I expected. So good job, and I'll see you guys next week.
See you, man.
Cool.
Bye.